She handed me a wrapped box and smiled like she'd already won. The woman who hated me from day one just gave me a gift at my own wedding. And when I opened it, my husband dropped to his knees and sobbed in front of 200 people. Then I set the box down on the table, picked up my bouquet, and walked back to my seat. 3 hours later, my husband's mother left the reception without saying goodbye to a single person. Okay, so let me take you back to the beginning, because if I just tell you about the box, you won't understand why the whole room went that quiet. My name is Rachel. I met Daniel at a coffee shop in October 2019. He spilled an oat milk latte on my laptop bag and then spent 45 minutes helping me wipe it down with napkins while we talked about nothing and everything. I know. Very rom-com. Very embarrassing in hindsight. Very us. Daniel is the kind of person who remembers that you mentioned once, in passing, that you liked peonies, and then shows up 6 months later with a grocery store bouquet of peonies just because. He's soft in a way that the world doesn't always make space for men to be. And I love that about him. His mom, Sandra, I need you to understand that from the very first time I met her, something felt off. Not villainously off. Just slightly wrong, like a painting hung 1 centimeter crooked. You can't always explain it. You just feel it in your chest. The first dinner I ever had at her house, she made lasagna. I said it was delicious. She said, "Oh, I made it lighter than I normally would. Daniel mentioned you were trying to lose weight." I had never said that to Daniel. Ever. I know because I've never been on a diet in my life. I am deeply committed to pasta, and I will die on that hill. I laughed it off. Daniel changed the subject. I filed it under awkward first meeting and moved on. But here's the thing about Sandra. She operated in the just plausible enough zone. Every comment, every jab, every tiny excavation of my self-esteem was always wrapped in just enough deniability that calling it out felt like overreacting. "Rachel, I love that you're so confident in that dress." I was wearing a green wrap dress I loved. "It must be so nice that you don't care what people think," said while staring at my shoes. "Daniel was with someone before you, very polished girl. You two are just so different." I asked what that meant. She said, "Oh, nothing, just different types." And Daniel, God, I love him, but Daniel had spent 31 years being trained not to see it. She was his mom. She was nice to his face. And when I'd bring something up, he'd get this look, not dismissive, more like pained. Like I was asking him to see something that would break something in him if he looked too directly at it. So I stopped bringing it up as much. Past me was such an idiot. We got engaged in July 2021. Daniel proposed on the same hiking trail where we'd had our third date. He'd carried the ring in his pocket for 4 miles and was sweating so badly by the time we got to the overlook that I thought he was having a medical event. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Sandra cried when we told her. "Happy tears," she said. She hugged me, called me daughter. I let myself believe it. Wedding planning was, well, Sandra had opinions. Many opinions. About the venue. A barn is so trendy right now, but will it still feel special in photos 10 years from now? About the menu. Do we really need 4 appetizer options? People always say they're watching what they eat. About my dress, which she never said anything directly negative about, but somehow managed to sigh every single time it came up in conversation. The dress, for the record, was a champagne-colored A-line with lace sleeves that I found at a small boutique called Ivory in June. It cost me $1,847, and every single penny of it was mine. I'd saved for 2 years. I loved that dress more than I've loved most things in my adult life. Sandra, at the final fitting, said, "It's very you, Rachel." I smiled and said thank you. I didn't ask what that meant. The wedding was September 18th, 2022. Outdoor ceremony at a vineyard, 200 guests, peonies everywhere, Daniel remembered. It was genuinely one of the most beautiful days of my life. The sky was that specific September blue that looks fake, like someone turned the saturation up. Ceremony went perfectly. Daniel cried during his vows. I cried. His dad cried. My best friend Keisha, who was my maid of honor, cried so hard she had to pass the tissues down the row. Reception started. We ate. We danced. We did the cake. Normal wedding things. And then, during the toasts, Sandra stood up. She had not told us she was planning a toast. This was not on the schedule. She tapped her champagne glass, smiled at the room, and said she had a few words and a small gift for the happy couple. The gift was wrapped in silver paper, sitting on the head table. I had not seen it placed there. To this day, I don't know when she put it. Her toast started fine. She talked about Daniel as a boy. Funny stories, sweet moments. The room was warm. I was warm. And then she pivoted. I wasn't sure about this marriage, she said, still smiling. I'll be honest. Daniel had a path, a plan, and sometimes when someone new comes in, you worry. You wonder. But she paused. Dramatic pause. Looked right at me. I've decided to trust Daniel's judgment. The room did that thing where everyone laughs slightly too loud because they're uncomfortable and don't know what else to do. And so I have a gift. For Rachel. Because I think it's time she understood what she's really married into. She gestured at the box. Everyone was looking at me. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. I stood up. I smiled the smile I had practiced for years. I picked up the box. I opened it. And the entire room went silent. Let me tell you what was in the box. At first glance, it looked like papers. A stack of papers, neatly organized, in a silver gift box. I almost thought, for one wild second, that it was some kind of legal document. Like she was giving me a prenup at the reception, which, insane, but with Sandra, nothing was off the table. But it wasn't that. It was photographs, and letters, and printed emails. Photographs of Daniel. Young Daniel, like college-age Daniel, maybe younger. And in every single one of them, he was laughing, genuinely laughing, in a way I hadn't seen in photos of him in years. And in some of them, there was a little boy with Daniel's exact nose and Daniel's exact ears and Daniel's exact smile. I looked up from the box. The room was completely silent. 200 people in absolute silence. And Daniel, my husband, my brand new husband, had his hand over his mouth and tears were streaming down his face. Not sad tears. Not guilty tears. Something else. Something I couldn't name yet. Sandra was still standing, still smiling. And she said, with this strange, triumphant energy, I think it's time your wife knew the whole story, Daniel. And then Daniel stood up. And in front of 200 people, in front of my parents, and his family and our friends, and the wait staff and the photographer, who was absolutely still filming, he said, his name is Noah. He's 7 years old. And Mom, you promised me. You promised me this was handled. Okay, I need to walk you back even further now. Because the story Sandra thought she was telling and the story that was actually true. Those were two very different things. About a week after the wedding, once the chaos had settled, and Daniel and I were sitting in our living room at 2 a.m. with cold takeout and red eyes. He told me everything. When Daniel was 23, he'd been in a short relationship with a woman named Priya. They broke up mutually. No drama. 2 months later, Priya found out she was pregnant. She didn't want to continue the pregnancy. Daniel supported her decision, whatever it was. But she decided to continue, and she decided, with her family's full support, that she would raise the baby as a single mother and did not want Daniel involved. She was clear. Her family was clear. There were documents. She had told him, directly, I don't want anything from you. I want to do this alone. Please respect that. Daniel had. He'd spent years grieving that quietly, grieving a child he legally and ethically had no claim to. A child whose mother had made a clear autonomous decision. A child he'd sent exactly one letter to through a lawyer, saying, if you ever want to know me, I'm here, and then stepped back. Sandra had known all of this. She had been there. She had helped Daniel process it. And she had saved everything, every photo, every letter, for 9 years. For this moment. Because she had decided that I needed to know what I was getting into. She had decided that this information was a weapon, that she could use it to destabilize us, to make me feel deceived, to remind Daniel that she held this over him. She had turned her own son's grief into a grenade, and she threw it at our wedding. The night Daniel told me everything, I sat very still for a long time. And then I said, so you didn't tell me because it wasn't fully my story to tell, he said. Priya asked for privacy. Noah doesn't know. And I didn't know how to explain something that painful without it defining how you saw me. I asked him if he still thought about Noah. He nodded. Every birthday, he said. He turned 7 in April. You guys, I cannot explain the specific kind of cry I did then. It wasn't angry. It was just sad. Sad for Daniel carrying that alone. Sad for a little kid who existed in the world. Sad that Sandra had looked at that grief and thought, useful. I cried in the bathroom for about 20 minutes. Keisha texted me 17 times. I didn't answer. Then I washed my face, put on Daniel's hoodie, Went back to the couch. Okay, I said. So what do we do about your mom? Here's where Keisha comes in. Keisha has known Sandra for about as long as I have. She's also known Sandra's sister, Diane, who is Sandra's opposite in almost every way. Where Sandra is polished and controlled and strategic, Diane is warm and chaotic and deeply allergic to nonsense. 2 days after the wedding, Keisha called me and said, "Okay, so Diane texted me." Diane had apparently watched the whole reception moment happen and had been so disturbed by it that she'd driven to Sandra's house that night. And what Diane told Keisha, what she then told me, cracked the whole thing open even wider. Sandra had been trying to break Daniel and me up for over a year. Not dramatically, not overtly, systematically. She'd been calling Daniel's ex, the very polished girl she'd mentioned at dinner, a woman named Claire, and keeping that connection warm. She'd told Claire that Daniel was having doubts. She'd told Daniel that I complained about his family to mine. I hadn't. She'd created small fires in small places and then stood nearby looking concerned. And the box had been her nuclear option, her final move if the smaller ones didn't work. She'd kept those photos and letters with the specific intention of using them to blow up our marriage before it started. She told Diane, Keisha said carefully, that she was doing it because she loves Daniel and she just didn't think you were, and I'm quoting, the right fit. And there it was. Not the polished version. The real one. I wasn't the right fit. I wasn't polished enough, put together enough, pedigreed enough. And Sandra, who had called me daughter and cried when we got engaged, had never, not once, actually let me in. Keisha had a moment on that call where she went quiet and I could hear her breathing. And she said, "Ratch, I want to be honest with you. I've seen some of this happening. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure and I didn't want to cause problems. And I'm sorry. I should have said something. That meant more to me than almost anything else that happened in all of this." I told her, "We have a plan to make." Sandra called the day after Diane talked to Keisha, left a voicemail. Her voice was light, almost cheerful, like the reception had been a charming little hiccup and now everything was fine. "Rachel, sweetheart, I hope you're settling in after the wedding. I'd love to have you both for dinner soon. Family is everything, you know. Family is everything." I wrote that down. I knew I'd need it later. I did not call her back. Daniel and I talked every night that week. Real talks, the kind we hadn't been having because I'd been softening my edges around his family for years. We talked about Noah. We talked about what boundaries actually looked like. We talked about the fact that Daniel, who is the gentlest person I've ever met, had been slowly shrinking himself to keep his mother comfortable, and whether either of us wanted to keep living that way. We decided we didn't. Sandra called twice more that week. Both times she got voicemail. On the third call, the tone shifted. "I just think it's important that we talk, Rachel. I did what I did out of love. I think you understand that. Family is everything, and I just want what's best for Daniel." I saved that voicemail. 2 weeks after the wedding, Sandra showed up at our apartment. She did not call ahead. She knocked at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was working from home. Daniel was at the office. I opened the door in leggings and Daniel's old university sweatshirt, the one Sandra had once, memorably, told Daniel looked sloppy when I wore it to their house. She looked at the sweatshirt. She looked at me. "Is Daniel home?" "No," I said. "But come in. This is where I want to tell you something." I was not performing calm. I actually was calm. Something had settled in me over those 2 weeks. I had cried my cries. I had been angry. I had eaten an entire pint of Ben and Jerry's cookie dough ice cream at midnight while watching true crime documentaries and texting Keisha obscene things about Sandra. I had done all of that. And now I was just done. The way you're done when you've finally taken off an uncomfortable shoe you've been wearing for years and you just stand there in your socks feeling the floor. I made her tea. I sat across from her at my kitchen table. She started talking. She said she was worried about Daniel. She said she hoped I understood she was coming from a place of love. She said, and I want you to really hear this, some information deserves to come out, Rachel. I just think you needed to know what you were really getting into. I let her finish. Then I said, "Sandra, can I ask you something?" She nodded. When Daniel was 23 and going through the hardest thing he'd probably ever experienced, losing a child he'd never get to know, where were you? She blinked. I was there for him. I was his mother. Yes, I said. You were there. And you collected every painful piece of evidence of that time. And you held it for 9 years. And then you threw it at him at his wedding. She started to say something about family is everything, and I held up one hand. I'm going to tell you what I know, I said. I know about Claire. I know about the calls. I know what you told her and what you told Daniel. I know about the plan. Her face changed. For just a second, just one fraction of a second, I almost felt something like pity. She looked genuinely shocked. Not guilty. Shocked. Like it had never occurred to her that there could be consequences. And then she collected herself. And she said, icily, I don't know what you think you know, Rachel. But family is everything. Daniel is my son. And this marriage. Sandra. I said it quietly. Diane told Keisha. Keisha told me. And I have your voicemails. The silence was different from the wedding silence. That one was shock. This one was reckoning. You have a choice, I said. You can leave right now, and in a few months, when you've thought about this, you can call Daniel. Daniel, not me, and apologize to him. Really apologize. Not for my sake. For his. Because what you did on our wedding day was not an act of love. It was an act of control. And Daniel deserves better than that from his mother. She stood up. Her hands were shaking slightly. You won't keep him from me, she said. It was supposed to sound powerful. It sounded like fear. I know, I said. That's not my goal. He loves you. I genuinely wish that were easier for all of us. She left. I closed the door. Stood in my kitchen for a moment. Then I texted Daniel. She came by. It went okay. I'll tell you everything tonight. Also, we're out of tea. Sandra did not take the loss quietly. Within 48 hours, she had called 4 of Daniel's aunts and uncles to give her version of events. She posted something on Facebook that was technically vague enough to be deniable, but which her entire friend group clearly understood was about me. Something about loving a child unconditionally even when outside forces try to damage that bond. Several of Daniel's cousins screenshotted it and texted him directly. She texted me once. Just once. It said, "You've shown your true colors, Rachel." I did not respond. Here is what Sandra had not accounted for, Diane. Diane had apparently been waiting for years for Sandra to go too far. The wedding moment was that moment. Diane called Daniel herself. Not to take sides, she said, but to say, your mother has done versions of this to everyone who's ever gotten close to you. I should have said something before. I'm sorry I didn't. Daniel's dad, who had been divorced from Sandra for 15 years, called to say, I'm glad you found someone good. Hold on to her. 2 of Sandra's closest friends, women who had been at the wedding, who had watched the box moment happen live, quietly reached out to me separately. One of them said, I've known Sandra for 20 years. What she did wasn't okay. I hope you know that. She lost more from that moment than she'd planned to gain. That's the part she didn't calculate. Daniel did eventually call her. It took him 6 weeks. I was not in the room, and I didn't ask for a full debrief. That was his conversation to have. What he told me after was simple. He told her that what she'd done had hurt him in a way he was still processing. That he loved her. That things were going to be different now. She cried, apparently. She said she'd only ever wanted what was best for him. He said, then trust that I found it. It's been almost 2 years now. Sandra and I are not close. We are civil. We see each other at family events. We make conversation. We do not pretend the conversation at the kitchen table didn't happen. We just don't revisit it either. There are moments where I catch her looking at me with something I can't fully read. Sometimes I think it's grudging respect. Sometimes I think she's just recalibrating. Daniel started a journal, his therapist's suggestion. He writes to Noah in it sometimes. He told me about a month ago, very quietly, that he'd reached out through the lawyer again. Not to push, not to create conflict, just to leave the door open in case Noah ever wanted to walk through it one day. I held his hand and didn't say anything. Sometimes that's all there is to say. Keisha was my maid of honor at the wedding, and she is still, without question, the person I call first. She admitted to me once, over wine, that she'd seen more of Sandra's behavior than she'd let on and had stayed quiet out of misplaced loyalty. I told her I understood. I do. These things are complicated. People stay quiet for reasons that make sense from the inside. The dress, by the way, the champagne A-line that Sandra called very you. I wore it at our 1-year anniversary dinner. Daniel looked at me in it and said, you are so beautiful in that dress, not in a performing for someone way. Just quietly, just to me. I thought about Sandra saying very you, and I thought, yeah, it is. That's the point. I'm not going to tell you I'm fully healed. I still sometimes walk into family events with my jaw slightly clenched. I still catch myself performing calmness in rooms where I don't need to perform anything. I'm working on it. Therapy helps. Cookie dough ice cream also helps, I'll be honest. But here's what I know now that I didn't know on September 18th, 2022. Some people will hand you something wrapped in silver paper and call it a gift. And sometimes the real gift is what you do after you open it. Whether you let it detonate you, or whether you set it down, pick up your bouquet, and walk back to your seat. I walked back to my seat, and Daniel was already there waiting for me.